Hello, and welcome to episode 111 of the PowerScore LSAT podcast. This is John Dinning in Los Angeles.
And this is Dave Killorn in fiery Napa Valley.
I usually know what you mean when you use that kind of adjective. Is it just hot, or is there smoke?
Now we've already had 2 fires. It's very early in the season for that.
Yeah.
So I'm already nervous.
Yeah, you guys got started in May this year. That bodes well.
I don't like it.
No. Well, if you can't water the fires down, at least you can have a drink. What is it today?
Well, this will all kind of make sense once we, get into the topic of the day as well as the song we've chosen. But it's kind of an homage to a Mai Tai. It's a throwback to an old classic movie, and it's a Napoleon Dynamite, which is kind of like just different fruit juices and I think more spicy coconut rum. So it's a lot of Captain Morgan, a little bit less Malibu, some grenadine, some passion fruit juice, some squeezed oranges and limes in there. So, exactly right up my alley, and definitely not up yours.
No, that's a perfect Dave drink. I do like a Mai Tai. In fact, every time I think of a Mai Tai, I think of the Beverly Hilton here and the pool bar, which you turned me on to, and which, with some luck here in a couple weeks, we'll get to enjoy together.
Yeah, you and I have some filming set in Los Angeles, so we should probably be running into each other in about 3 weeks. But Beverly Hilton poolside, I don't know if we'll get there, but I wish Trader Vic's was still at the Beverly Hilton.
Me too. We'll have to see what replaced it. I'm sure it's going to disappoint.
I'm sure it's some kind of like steel and glass, restaurant that has no soul.
That sounds about right. I've taken it even simpler today. I was in Texas a couple weeks ago, and I'm still feeling a bit of nostalgia. San Antonio specifically, which was a really good time. And so I'm drinking a Shiner Bock, good old Texas beer. Nothing fancy.
That's a classic Texas beer. All Texans know that one. Always good to have a nice Shiner when you're down there, especially if it's like Austin and that general area, which I like quite a bit.
Yeah, me too. I've got some Austin time planned for the summer, which is the worst time to go, but I'm still going to do it.
Well, enjoy that. But interestingly enough, the topic of the day is we're going to talk about PrepTest 92, which is the June 2020 LSAT Flex, and we're going to focus on the logic games that were scored on that. And as it turns out, that section of games really isn't that tough. And one of the things we're doing is we kind of recap games from various prep tests. Is based on the year of the prep test, we then go out and find a song that hopefully matches it. So this was 2020, which I would say overall was a rather barren year for quality music in terms of our taste. But BTS put out a song called Dynamite, and I think a lot of people who took this test and got this section thought it was dynamite in the best way, as if this is a good thing. I feel great about it. That song, John, as we were talking earlier, the video on YouTube has 1.487 billion views. That's insane.
That is ridiculous. It means like one in every, 6 people on the planet, 5 people on the planet have watched that video. I mean, again, those are unique views.
Yeah, a couple people watching it a lot.
Yeah.
I think I also told you this is that my daughter's a big BTS fan.
I was going to say 100,000 views are your kids.
Yeah, probably so. At least 100,000 listens in our house, but mostly of Butter, not Dynamite.
Sure.
And they did a concert from Las Vegas that was televised or at least streamed online a couple weeks ago. And of course, she wanted to watch it. And I noticed in the kind of like the presentation that by the end, there were over 35 million comments on the stream.
Jeez.
And I was like, that's just the worldwide power that this band has is absolutely amazing.
Well, there you go. And of course, to take us full circle, there's the tie-in to your Napoleon Dynamite drink.
Yeah.
The song actually led to the drink for once, which is not.
It actually did. We picked the song first because it was one of the few from 2020 that I was like, all right, I like that song. It was either them or Blackpink, in my opinion. So we were going to go K-pop-ish. And I think that song's pretty good. So let's move on.
Yeah, let's talk LSAT world. There's not a whole lot to mention here, but we'll give a status update on the impending June test. The registration for that is passed. It is coming up fast and furious here. That test starts next Friday, June 10th, and a little surprisingly is only going to run Friday and Saturday as the main testing administration days. I think you and I were both of the opinion that they probably would and certainly should add a third day given the volume, but they didn't. I think they feel like they can handle it on just 2 days.
They do think they can handle it on 2 days. I actually reached out to them and questioned them on this because I was like, really? You want to kind of push it to the max volume? We know they can handle and have handled 10,000 plus test takers a day in the past. Whether or not it's a good idea is a different question. Right now, the current registration enrollment for that test is 21,725. Now, that'll drop. It's continually dropping. In fact, in the last 3 weeks, it's melted off about
10%, something like that.
Yeah, about 10%, about 2,300 people have dropped off. We know that'll continue. That's natural. It happens before every single LSAT. But I thought for sure once they hit 20,000, that in their mind, they're like, hey, let's do 3 days. So it's going to be jam-packed. And the first thing that means for test takers is, just be on alert for problems. The more people in the system, the more likely there are issues or delays. So if you show up and it takes 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes to get started, be ready for it. Don't get frustrated. Just take your time and let's hope they don't have any major technical issues as we've seen on some of the recent tests.
Yeah, I'd say the most likely issue to arise is just delays. This won't crash the system necessarily, but it could stall you a little bit getting hooked up with a proctor and starting the test at the time you picked. So again, I know sometimes people hear this and they immediately get skittish or anxious. Don't be. Just know going into it the circumstances and how this could affect you.
Yeah, and if you're looking for some last-minute assistance prior to that June LSAT, we've got some free seminars coming up. The one that would be probably most useful given the timeline here is on the 7th of June. That is on common flaws that you typically see in LSAT logical reasoning. It's a really cool seminar. So if you want a little flaw work, definitely hit that. There's another one on June 22nd about templates and identifying those. I think another great webinar. One on July 5th, right after the July 4th holiday, that is on parallel reasoning. I could also vouch for that as being a high quality kind of webinar. And then perhaps the highest of all quality webinars, John, you and I doing the crystal ball. And there's a little program note here. We have changed the date on this. We have moved it earlier by about 2 weeks or so. And change. It is now going to be on July 7th, and this is going to be the crystal ball for both August and September. And the reason we made this decision was actually your suggestion, John, and I agree with it wholeheartedly, is that this will give students who are taking the August test and the September test more time to prepare with the knowledge from that webinar. We know we'll have the June test in our back pocket at that point. We can use that to alter some of the things that we would recommend. But this, instead of giving you 7 to 10 days, this is going to give you, 4 to 5 weeks at a minimum to be able to kind of shape your studying, focus on some of the elements. So we think it's better from a preparation standpoint.
Yeah, this is certainly to the student's advantage. One of the biggest hurdles that you and I often face in trying to do anything coordinated like this is just finding free time where we both have overlapping gaps where we can do it. And so we had targeted the end of July, and we were lucky to find a day. And then we got doubly lucky to now find one early July, July 7th. So I was really excited that we could move this up about 18 days. And I think it'll be really, really useful for students to have that extra 2+ weeks to get in there and work with the problem sets and to consider the advice that we give.
And so if you'd enrolled early in that, you're still enrolled. Nothing's actually changed. You'll still get the same access. Just know that it is now July 7th. Instead of later on in July as it was before.
Yeah, that'll be fun. And of course, that also gives a little over a week from when the June test results will release, which are also going to, I think, inform some of the talking points that we cover in that crystal ball. The June test releases on the 30th of June, and then I think to the day, a week later, we'll do the crystal ball.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we'll have time to actually break it down, and you and I are ready for what we want to do. I think we have some changes in mind that we're going to make for that next crystal ball. Either way, we hope we see you there. And as usual, it is free to the public for that opening salvo on that one night only. Thereafter, we put it in our online student centers, and that is the only place you'll be able to access them at that point. On that note, let's move over to the main event. Let's talk about what was, commonly known as PrepTest 92 now. They have a little baby plus on
92
it.
92 plus.
Yeah, June 2020 was the test that these games were last used in, and I guess kind of connected to the rest of this test. They used it after this exam. So let's talk a little bit about that history, because it is a complicated history with this exam. This was a test that they, at least from a logic game standpoint, they used over and over again in different formats. This is the final usage in terms of like its release. Like now that they've released it, it's over and done with.
Yeah, this thing is properly retired once it goes public.
But even after they had presented it in the so-called June 2020 test, they used it 3 more times thereafter. So, John, why don't you do a rundown of where we first saw this game section and then some of the other places that we saw it and kind of give a sense to people of like the history and how many people over time have actually seen this.
Yeah, I think this is interesting. I know you do. We'll see if we're the only two. But this is one of those original February tests that for decades, literally decades, was the test they would always keep in reserve. They wouldn't release. It was non-disclosed. And this lasted all the way up until they started doing more than 4 administrations a year. So the first instance that we're aware of this test being used as an official administration dates back 10 years. This was the February 11th, 2012 LSAT originally. And so they used it back in 2012, shelved it for about 5 years, and then dusted it off and started to use it for certain types of reissues and repeats, often in more like disparate instances or scattered fringe instances. For instance, the first repeat that we have is the September 2017 European LSAT. So they used it overseas as a repeat, but not domestically. That same month, there was I think it was a hurricane in Florida, and it forced them to cancel some test administrations. So in September 23rd, 2017, in Florida specifically, they offered some makeup LSATs. They used this test there. They used it again in January 2019 in Asia, March 2019 again in Europe, June 2020, which is the main reference point for us here, as the LSAT Flex, one of the first ever. I think this was the second LSAT Flex administration ever. In June 2020. So that's going to be our main point of reference for what this test actually is. That's how most people currently know it. And then, as you said, 3 times since then. October 2020 is a makeup test, paper makeup. March 2021 as an LSAT Flex makeup, so that week after. And then we've seen them use it as recently, on the final time, in August of 2021 as another makeup test for that August date. So this is a test that's really, it's gotten around. I was trying to find a delicate way to put that.
Tens of thousands of people have taken this test over the last decade. And that final usage, which was a makeup test in August of 2021, they released this exam shortly thereafter, and this game section came out. And that means that now that it's been publicly released, it is retired. It will not be used. So sometimes people ask me about the predictions that we make in the crystal ball about test reuses. Well, if you go back to one big candidate, it would be the February LSATs in the so-called older days. Well, here's your February 2012 LSAT. This one is kind of like irretrievably marked off the list. It has now been released. And so that's how we're able to narrow the field in terms of the predictions that we make. We're able to say, well, they released this test or they did this with that particular test, and now it's no longer a candidate for reuse. Again, once a test is put out into the public, and they actually give everyone a copy of it, then it's done for. They do not reuse it, or they should not, at least.
Yeah,
there's a few minor
critical distinction that sometimes gets missed. But take the February 2013 LSAT, which is a test that they have not released yet, like they have this one. They still reuse that test. That one still comes up from time to time, even now, 9 years later.
That is exactly the case. So you can kind of see what it is. It's these non-disclosed tests. The big value is that they can be reused over and over again. And as long as they select the groups so that they don't overlap, it works really well for them. And that's why there's this kind of staggered usage. Here it is in Europe, then it's in Asia, then it's a makeup test. That way, they know that there's not going to be overlap. And there is certainly other usages on here that just aren't tracked. Old Sabbath day reuses and so forth, where the groups in play were really, really rather small.
Yeah.
But the nice thing about the test that they released, that PrepTest 92 Plus, was that they released the 3 scored sections because it was a flex test. And then there is another 4th section on that test that's a second logic game section that is designated as experimental. We're not going to talk about that section. We're going to talk about the scored section tonight.
Yeah.
And as I said before, one of the reasons we chose the song Dynamite is because this is a really reasonable section of games. It didn't blow anybody up, and a lot of people actually felt really strong and powerful afterwards.
Yeah. The inclusion of that experimental is why 90, 91, and 92 are called plus in LSAT nomenclature. The plus includes or refers to the inclusion of an experimental section. But of course, all we care about are the real games. And so that's what we're here to discuss.
And so let's get into it because, this is not what I consider to be a devastating set of games. It is actually the type of game set that I think everybody should want to encounter. And if you're asking for a certain type of game set and section, one of the things you have to make sure when you're studying is that you really know what you're doing. I would expect that students who are looking to score well on the LSAT would see this game section and be salivating over it because you can command and control this section really well if you know what you're doing. I don't think it's a high difficulty section. As I've said before, none of them are easy. There's always, challenges inside. But what we want to focus on is largely the setups. We'll focus a little bit less on the questions because the setup in a lot of these games really helps solve a lot of the questions very quickly. And so just keep that in mind. You should be able to take this section and just dominate it for the most part. It is that type of section. And the expectation on this test was that you would be able to do that because the other sections were, I think, more challenging in comparison.
Yeah. The difficulty was offset in reading comp primarily. But there's a reason we picked a song called Dynamite for this discussion. And this was something of a gift. A slam dunk if you know what you're doing in games. And to me, to dive right into it, the first game is particularly emblematic of that. This game was an absolute layup for people who were decent with basic linear and sequencing ideas.
And it's kind of cool, too, because it's about law firm interviews. And it's a classic basic linear game that's balanced out. You've got 6 spaces, and then you've got 6 interviews going on. So right away, you're able to read through things and realize that it's a one-to-one relationship. And that's beautiful. That's exactly what you want when you have like a straightforward basic linear game like this to start off a section. What you have to say to yourself is, let's gain time. In fact, I get a little concerned because I think maybe something much worse is coming. That doesn't really happen on this test, which is one of the happy accidents of how things came together. But it opens up 6 into 6. You got to feel good about that. It's a quick draw out. And then what do you end up with? You end up with 5 rules that kind of play out here. And so it's built along the lines of every standard linear game. 1 variable in each space. There's no duplication. There's no 3 in 1 space. There's no empty spaces. So that's what I mean when I say one-to-one.
Yeah.
When you get into the rules, you discover that the first 3 rules are very straightforward linear type of rules. And then the last 2 are conditional that are going to trigger scenarios based upon individual placement. So you look at the first 2 rules, and the thing I like about them is they combine together perfectly. They make a 3-variable sequence. So now you have, 1 variable ahead of another, which is ahead of another. And that gives, at least the way I look at it, is a nice kind of mental template for how things are moving. It's like an accordion of variables. They could be first, second, third. They could be fourth, fifth, sixth. They could be first, third, and fifth. But they're always going to be in that sequence. And then you get the second, or rather the third rule, which is essentially just a block. And since they're all dealing with different variables, the first 3 rules address 5 of the 6 variables. So I was really happy because having a block inside that sequence, now I'm looking at it and I'm thinking to myself, this is really limited.
Yeah. It's a 3-variable sequence and a 2-variable, 2 different variable block. And of course, each of those also creates its own host of not laws that you can start to draw. There are inferences that arise immediately from placement restrictions based on these rules.
Well, you can knock out several variables just from the first and last spots. You can kind of see what's happening. But I love this because if you place any of the variables, it starts pushing around the block, for example. If you place the block, it pushes around the sequence. So I like this because I can see the limitations coming through. And then we go to the 4th rule. And the variable that was missing, in this case, it's H. Well, that's the one that comes right out of the gate. And they're like, all right, we're going to give you a conditional scenario. And since that's the 6th variable, so to speak, the one that was missing, it was really welcome to me to see that start off the 4th rule. And given what they tell you, they give you, if H is first, then they're going to take another variable and place that, and it's part of the sequence. you actually, from the fourth rule, get a single possible result. So when H is first, you can actually chart it out so that you know where every other variable is. So I'm like, well,
it
that's
immediately places that 3-variable sequence and then leaves one double space for the block, and everything
exactly
fills
right.
in. Yeah.
And that's funny because you know when that happens that's not going to be a feature rule. It's too limited. It's like it'll show up maybe once, twice in the game, but they're not going to come back over and over again. So when I start thinking about power rules, I'm like, the first three rules combine really well. The fourth rule is super powerful, but so specific it won't be used a lot.
Let me
And
add
then
a
you get
point to that before you move to the fifth rule, because I
Hit
know where you're going. I can feel the momentum. And it's this: if the rule as given triggers something so individualized and so complete, almost exhaustive in terms of where everything goes, as you say, they're very unlikely to test it directly. What I'd be looking for or guarded for is the contrapositive. It's far more likely that a rule like that is going to be tested based on if the necessary doesn't occur,
Yeah.
what begins to happen. So that rule, as soon as I saw that rule, I was thinking about what happens when L doesn't go forth, when something else does or L is placed elsewhere.
And it's even more widespread than that, because I was thinking about this earlier. When you have H being first and it triggers a single solution, if any single variable is not in the right place, the contrapositive is enacted, because the necessary condition here is that all 5 of the other variables are in their specific spot.
Yeah, it's a 6-placement outcome, and any of those placements varying means that outcome didn't happen. That is the contrapositive.
Yeah. So like in that solution, M and J are second and third. Well, if you get another question that says M is fourth, automatically you know H can't be first.
Yep.
That's the contrapositive in action. And that's just, I just made that up as an example. So that is a really powerful idea to know that, well, I could just eliminate H and maybe that reduces the number of options, which are already rather limited for the first space. That's how they start to set you up for future questions in this game.
Yeah, and for future mistakes, because to me, if what you're focused on is the contrapositive, you're in great shape. If you're focused solely on the necessary condition, though, you're playing a dangerous game. They love to test the mistake in reversal with something like this.
Oh, you mean to throw L in fourth and be like,
exactly
you
what
think
I mean.
H is...
Now I think
H
I know
gotta
where
be
H
first.
has to go. No. And again, if you're not tracking what we mean by contrapositives and mistaken reversals, I'm glad you're here for this conversation because you have some learning to do.
You've got more studying to do, yes. That's a foundational point in the LSAT. So then we get to the last rule, and it's another conditional rule. This time, instead of it being the front side, it's the back side. They put F in the last position, and then they connect it to one of the variables in the block, which means it's not just that F is sixth and you get another variable place, you get another 2-variable place. And since you have F at the end of that sequence, now you have that block positioned, you still have the other 2 variables in the sequence that you have to account for. This doesn't look like there's a whole lot of different directions they could go in. And really, there's just 2 templates and a total of 3 possible solutions when this rule is in play. So if F is last, you only have 3 possible outcomes. And that means these last 2 rules are really super limiting. And as John said, they're not going to test them all that much at that point. You'll see them, but it's really about the early stuff in this particular game.
I'll make one final point, but this is probably not my final point, which is, to me, when I do a game like this, there's a very distinct difference in how I would attack it under test conditions, worried about the clock and the time and the opportunity, frankly, to bank some time and get what are pretty low-hanging fruit points, and how I would actually do this just in studying or trying to learn this. If I encountered this game somewhat early in my prep, I would probably explore those hypotheticals. What happens when F is 6? What happens when H is first? Let's write them out. Let's take these things apart and really see how they operate. Because that's how you learn, in a way, what to avoid or what's unnecessary to pursue when time matters more.
Yeah. And I think you and I probably did this game slightly differently. Anyway, when I encountered those last 2 rules, I actually slated out all the solutions. So even when, H being in 1, that was really obvious. There's only one solution. I could see it almost immediately. So I just charted it out. I imagine you did as well.
I saw it, but I didn't write it.
Fair enough. And then with F being in 6th, when I knew where the block was going to be placed, which was essentially second and third, I was just like, I'm going to jot these down as well. And that is something where you and I sometimes differ. I tend to draw a few more solutions than you do. It just makes me happy to do it. I like to see it. I feel like I learn as I go through that process. And also, I'm lazy and I don't want to have to tax my memory. So putting it down on paper means that I can be as lazy as possible throughout the rest of the game.
It just shows the subjectivity of laziness, doesn't it? I'm lazy and don't want to write it down. You're lazy and don't want to have to think about it past writing it down.
See, we're just all lazy. It's just a matter of
Yeah.
what our method of kind of like work avoidance is.
Right.
All right. So the point that we would make is this really isn't a templates game. It's just that the last two rules have templating aspects, and that's completely normal. You could write down the templates for those and not do anything else in this game that's templating or solutions based, and you'd have done it really very much the way that we did it. And at this point, I felt pretty great about the game. I was like, I love this. I expect them to see some fairly straightforward questions where I just have to kind of like follow the chain reaction that's going to occur when variables are placed. And that's largely what happened. And the beautiful thing about it, John, is 7 questions.
I was going to say,
on
let's
this.
not overlook the gift that is 7 questions on an easier game.
Thank you. I mean, you got to start off this test and think, I am banking in 7 correct answers right here. And the first question is, a standard list question. So we demand that you get those correct. There's no excuse for missing them unless you have badly misread something. So right coming off, that first question that you're going to be in good shape. You'll have another solution that you can add, kind of like the arsenal of understanding. That'll come back and help us out later on. It helps knock off an answer in number 7. And they throw in a couple of variations. They have some maximum minimum questions here, which is not unexpected when you have sequences floating around. Mm-hmm. You've got a question that is posed in terms of false, probably question number 5, which I think is maybe the hardest question on this particular game. It just takes a little bit of time because it works through the sequencing and block options, and it requires a little bit of work for the answers. And then you end up kind of like working down to the last question, which tells you that there's a not law in this game that a lot of people I don't think would have picked up. And it shows how you can have a setup to a game that is incomplete, that doesn't include every inference, doesn't include every not law, and it's not that big of a deal. They ask us about it in question 7. You can just do some work. Use your prior work. Questions 1 and 2 will knock off answer choices E and C, respectively. Now you're down to just 3 answers to consider, and it doesn't take that much time to be able to work through it. It's really a very doable game.
Yeah, and again, this might be one additional place where you and I tend to part paths. I tend to jump around a lot through questions in a game. So when I saw question 2, which was a max-min situation, and then I saw it again in question 4, another max-min, I save those to the end because I just want the work that I know I'm probably going to have to do on local questions, like maybe 3 or 6, to help me out. So I did not do these questions in chronological numerical order. I hopped around and came back to 2, which was helped by question 6. I came back to 4 at the very end. And then interestingly enough, I saw question 7 earlier than I would have otherwise because it's the last question. And that actually gave me a new inference. There was something missing from my initial setup in terms of not laws. And question 7 revealed it to me, and that helped elsewhere too. Wish I'd seen that question even sooner.
Yeah, the classic global absolute question revealing some truth that you hadn't actually figured out.
Yeah. There's a restriction on the second spot that I had not picked up in my setup, and I'd be shocked if many people had. But 7 reveals it to you. But the good news about the questions doing this is even with an incomplete setup, the questions tell you where to look. You don't have to scrutinize your entire diagram. These actually give you a map of sorts as to where to consider things further. So something about that second spot's more restricted than I thought.
Exactly.
Let's dive in. Let's dig in.
And in this particular instance, you did something that I usually do, but on more difficult games. I think what we did was we made different decisions based upon the context here. Mm-hmm. I felt this game wasn't that challenging and that I had really good command over the rules. And I was like, I'm just going to go do the questions. When I saw that minimum question as number 2, I didn't feel like that was a problem. I was like, I can push F as far back or as far forward as I need to and figure it out. And it's not going to take me much time. On a harder game or one where I felt less confident, I would not have done that question second. So it was all about my relative comfort. And I think that's a reasonable decision. You were like, I'm going to do that almost regardless. That's the strategy. It's optimal.
Yeah, I
In
tend to
this case,
default to that.
yeah, in this case, I was like, normally I would do that in a tough situation, but in an easier situation, I'm like, I'm just going to crush this.
Cruise control. Yeah,
Cruise control.
I feel you. More than one way to skin a cat, as that very strange idiom goes. But it does to show, I've never understood that. So, what does that even mean? It goes to show that there are different paths and approaches you can take to still lead to success. I don't know that you or I did the game any faster, but I know we did the game equally successfully, and that's the key.
Yeah, I think we just made different decisions that played to our own personal preferences and strengths.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of cats, my brother-in-law was bit by a cat this week, and I've discovered how dangerous cat bites are.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I didn't know
full
this.
of bacteria. They're horribly infectious.
Terrible mouths full of bacteria, but because their needle-like teeth can go so deep,
Mm-hmm.
they can inject that bacteria down like into the muscle. This cat bit him so hard it hit bone.
Oh my God.
Yeah, he had to go to, urgent care and had to deal with it for like 3 or 4 hours. And I guess a lot of people look at dog bites and because they look bloodier and they're bigger, they think the dog bite is worse. But because a dog has such blunt teeth,
It's
relatively,
more superficial. Yeah.
yeah, it's more superficial. It's far less likely to get infected. Apparently, cat bites are very highly likely to become infected.
Vaccination by cat.
Yeah. So anyway, I have dogs, but
Yeah, no. I'm
I like
not even going
cats,
to
though.
ask the circumstances by which your brother fought a cat.
My dog was barking at it.
Brother-in-law. Yeah. I won't
So-
pin this on your immediate family. This is
No, my dog was barking at it. The cat was agitated. My brother-in-law went to pick the cat up. The cat said, "You're an enemy," and bit him super hard. And thus his vacation was ruined, or at least
there you go. That afternoon
Affected.
sure was. At least he's in a place where there's always a drink on hand.
yeah, that hasn't stopped him from drinking. I've seen him go out swimming, he's riding his bike. He's doing everything you would do on a vacation.
Yeah. I'm at your house, but also I guess Napa in general.
Yeah, well, that's true.
Yeah.
All
Both.
are, flush with alcohol.
Both true.
Let's go to the second game, John.
Yeah, well, we're talking about vagrants staying places. Let's talk about a game about an apartment building and its tenants, and interestingly enough, as we will
Pet
see,
owners.
how it is that they do or don't own pets. So that was a topical segue that we did not.
We didn't
intend.
even intend that. That's just the way it came out. You said skin a cat, and I was like,
Speak of the devil.
cats are on my mind.
So, game 2, apartment building tenants, as we call it. We move away from this basic linear idea of 6 into 6 that we saw in the first one, and now we have to start dealing with grouping, first of all, and a disparity, a mismatch of numbers, because here you have 5 tenants living in, at most, 3 apartments. And then it subdivides or gives some sort of subcategory of the tenants that 3 of the 5 own pets, the other 2 do not.
That's powerful.
Mm-hmm.
They subdivide that group where you've got these 5, and now they've told you that there's a subgroup of 3 and another subgroup of 2. How did you show that when you did like the pets, non-pets?
I'll be curious to see if we actually came together on this one, because so far, no. I used subscripts. So I had a P subscript and then a /P subscript.
Same.
Huh. What do you know?
Some people do it with sub P and then sub NP. I'm
Mhm.
fine with that too. It's not my preferred thing because I usually use the slashes to do it, but it works as well. You just have to have some way of saying who is who, because they do tell you at one point that Helena has a pet. So to me and you, as it turns out, we probably saw her as H sub P
That's exactly what I
thereafter.
have here. And yes, we'll see from a rule, H sub P is in a block with at least one other person. H sub P
Mhm.
can't be a solo tenant.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
So yeah,
So
there you go. So the first thing that caught my eye in this game was the numbers themselves. Numbers always control games unless they're balanced out like game 1, in which case you can set them aside, which feels good.
mhm.
5 into 3. I knew the numbers were going to be important, and then this split of those 5 into 3 and 2 with the pets was going to be important. And then the rules themselves actually help to define this a little bit further. So it talks about the idea in the first rule, speaking of numerical distribution of the people, that you can't have more than one vacant apartment. In other words, you can't put all 5 people into the same thing. At least 2 of these apartments have people in them.
That's exactly right. Because if you put 5 in one, the other 2 apartments would be vacant.
Mhm.
But it is interesting because when you're reading this, it's all about like the little clues they give you and the way you react to this. When I saw 5 going into 3, usually in those scenarios, what you have is a minimum of 1 in each group.
Yeah.
In this case, it would be minimum of 1 in each apartment. And when that occurs, there's only 2 outcomes that you can have. It's either 3-1-1 as an unfixed distribution where the 3 could be any of the apartments, or 2-2-1. So I knew right then if it held to that particular form, I was looking at 2 numerical distributions. And a lot of times when you get just 2 distributions, you might start thinking about templating it, or at least kind of exploring the directions there.
That's how powerful numbers are, especially when they're limited to just 2 possible ways that you can arrange them or spread them out.
Yeah.
You used the word clue before, and I love this. I don't know if this will be the most important thing someone hears from us today, but it's going to be right up there, which is don't make any assumptions. They tell you in the first rule and almost reiterate the idea that you can have an empty apartment, potentially. Mm-hmm. If they hadn't said that, you'd still have to assume it was possible.
Yeah, you don't know because they've given you no other information. And another thing that I think is useful here is to think about what they're doing with games these days, because we've talked a lot about this, less certain types of setups. 5 into 3, where there's a minimum of 1 in each apartment, gives you these 2 super clean distributions that I was just talking about. Mm. Well, if you're the test makers, do you really want that? No, you really don't, because you want to make things harder these days. You want to make them more abstract. And so what do? They give you that first rule, and then all of a sudden, you now know that it's not a minimum of 1, that there can be, but does not have to be a 0 floating around out there. So if you zeroed it out, that would seemingly at first give you a couple different options, such as 4-1 or 3-2. Mm-hmm. As we'll discover momentarily, 4-1 is not possible. Like a 4-1-0 is not going to be possible. But we'll come back to that in just a second.
Yeah, and the reason that 4-1 is not possible is based on the second rule. This is a very powerful rule, and it tells you essentially this, that pet owners can only live with pet owners, and non-pet owners have to live with non-pet owners, which means those 3 people with pets can't live with the 2 people without pets. So you get a clean break 3 and 2 in terms of, and they don't at this point specify who's who, but you at least know there's a group of 3 that can go together, and there's a group of 2 that has to avoid them.
Yeah.
Those 2 might be split, those 2 might be together, those 3 might be split or together. But they can never mix and match, and that's really important for the distributions. It means you can never put 4 people in the same apartment, like we were saying before.
Yeah, because if you're going to do 4 people, you'd say, well, I can take 3 pet owners and a non-pet owner. That's a rule violation. Or 2 non-pet owners and 2 pet owners. That's also a violation. Yeah. So you can't have 4. That tells you that from a numerical distribution standpoint, the lowest you can have is 0 in one of the apartments. The most you can have in any apartment is always going to be maxed at 3.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean that every solution has 3. In fact, there's a solution to this game that's 2-2-1 in whatever order. That is completely fine. So you don't have to have 3, but you are kind of capped at 3 due to the pet non-pet rule.
Which adds a third distribution possibility. If it's 3-2-0, which is now possible, remember, before 5 into 3 is usually 3-1-1 or 2-2-1 if someone has to go into each position. But with an empty position, you could have the 3 pet owners together and the 2 non-pet owners together, and then something stays empty. That's now allowed here as well.
Yeah, and that scenario, if and when it occurs, is actually really powerful because we're going to find out that they place one of the variables who's not a pet owner. And so if you had a 3-2-0 kind of setup, you'd know that the 2 was the non-pet owners. You'd know automatically, as we will find out, that it would have to be a particular apartment that was being used there.
Perfect. The third rule is just a not block separation of 2 variables f and g. It doesn't specify anything about pets or not, but it does tell you those people can't live in the same spot. And then we get a very powerful rule where it finally starts to pair a person with their pet status, which is H. H has a pet and has to live with at least one other person, who then, you could infer, must also own a pet.
Exactly. H is not going to be a loner. They're not going to be living alone. They're always got somebody else. And because we know about the way the pets work, if they're going to live with someone else, that person must also be a pet owner. So when I drew out that block, I had H with the sub P, and then above it, I just put a blank line, as in there's a variable here with a sub P on it, meaning I know someone's there, and then I put a block around the whole thing. That's going to be joining H You could alternatively, I like that representation better than putting H, P, and then like a block around it with a slash, like it can't
Not
be
a
alone.
single. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's slightly more confusing. I like mine because it's more visually representative of the fact that 2 spaces at the least are being taken.
I did exactly what you did with one extra piece. I put a plus sign in there in that empty space just to remind myself that it was one or more.
I put at least at the top of the
Oh,
block.
there you go.
We had it. It was just, small differences.
Yeah.
But the gist of what's going on there is I want to be able to see that there's always 2 spaces being taken up by one of the relationships that involves H. Now I can see that.
Yeah. People are surprised sometimes because they think games are so formulaic that clearly 2 people who preach the same philosophy and system, you and I in this case, must do everything identically. It must be just interchangeable. And for the most part, it is. But in terms of little notations and things, we do depart every once in a while. And to me, this is the fun of games. There's an artistry almost to it, where you represent things in a way that are clearest to you and that you feel are going to give you the best opportunity to know what they mean when you refer back to them.
Yeah. And I think, in more straightforward games that are tighter, especially a lot of the games from the past, our diagrams end up being more similar.
Sure.
The looser the rules get, the stranger, the more open-ended, I think that's where you start to see these small differentiations. But they're really very small notational aspects. A lot of what we do is still the same. They, by and large, look identical, but there are differences that you and I can see inside of it. And it just goes to show that you got to do what feels right for you when you're inside of this.
100%. I know for some people they think that that's too loose, but to me it's actually encouraging because it means you're not married to some like super rigid system that you can never actually operate on the fringes of or bend the lines of. I love to test the boundaries of things and bend things a little bit to my own whim in the moment. So anyone who's listening to this, you do have some license here.
It's not just license too. It means that there's no perfection, so you don't have to hold yourself to some standard of perfection. Oh, I didn't diagram this correctly. I'm not worried about that. I'm worried about whether or not you understood it and whether your representation has efficiency and optimality to it. Because sometimes what's optimal for me might be different for somebody else. And in other cases, it's like, well, that's universally better or that's universally worse. So that's why we look at all this beforehand to kind of make these discussions.
All right, we're nearly at the end, and this is a rule you alluded to a second ago, and here we've now arrived. We finally get to place a person in a spot. The final rule has J in apartment 3, but it goes one step further. It also tells you that J does not own a pet, which means apartment 3 is pet-free, whether it's just J or J gets the other non-pet owner.
Right. But it's going to max out apartment number 3 with 2 people. And of course, it means that Helena, who is a pet owner, is knocked out of apartment 3, which means that her block is now in apartment 1 or apartment 2. So I really like that as well. Like these little things start pushing it around. And I didn't say to myself, gosh, boy, you got H in either 1 or 2. I'm going to start showing templates of all that stuff. No, I let it be.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to worry about it. I did know that if H was in apartment 1, there's a maximum of 2 people there, then I'd have a good sense of what I was looking at with the other options. There are limitations. And if somebody sketched out a little bit of this, I'm not complaining. Like I said, I find template exploration to be one that is often rewarding. And I could see some template work being done here. I just, again, felt I've got a pretty good control of this. The pet, non-pet thing is powerful. I've got a really good sense of the numerical distributions. The 320, the 311, and the 221. I feel like I can adjust on the fly inside the questions.
Yeah, I'm glad you just referenced this. We kind of glossed over it. There's one final rule that becomes particularly important now that we know that H and its block is going to be in 1 or 2, where the first apartment can't have more than 2 people. It can be empty. It can have 1, it can have 2, but it can't get the 3 in some of these distributions. So if you're ever in a position with 3 people, it's got to be apartment 2. Apartment 1 is 2 max. Apartment 3 is 2 max. So again, you see the numbers controlling everything here. We glossed over that rule, but I wanted to bring it back to.
No, that's actually a great point. And if you know that not all the pet owners are together, you know that they're going to have to be in apartments 1 and 2 as well. So there are things floating around. That doesn't mean that is that they're always taking up both apartments 1 and 2, but we know they can't be in 3. So either they're all in one single apartment, which would be apartment number 2, or they're split across apartments 1 and 2 in some configuration where H is in a double.
Perfect.
2, 1, 1, 2, depends.
Perfect. And with that, the questions then kind of lay down at your feet. I felt really good about this setup once I had a good handle on the rules in terms of the numbers. I was like, just track H, track the pets, count 3, count 2, and everything else should fall into place. And they really did. We start with a list question, pretty straightforward, a free point.
My favorite.
Really. Yeah. And then there were a bunch of questions, a bunch of local questions, frankly. Until the very end, they're all local.
Yeah, in fact, you got 6 questions in this, which I thought was, again, nice.
Generous.
7 questions, then 6 questions. You're always watching your time, but you've now done 13 questions in the first 2 games, and neither game was a true killer. Again, I think this game is harder than the first one, but it's controllable if you're watching what's happening with the distribution and with the pet, non-pet relationships. So you go through that list question. Then, as you said, there are 4 local questions, which are great because it means you're just doing work. It's not that tough. It's just kind of like connecting the dots from rule to rule and kind of going through it and saying what's possible. Yeah, there's like a, could be true except question in there that we're floating around with. And so I have to kind of keep an eye on that. But then I get to the end and it's kind of like, again, one of these kind of global absolute questions. In this case, kind of like which cannot be a complete and accurate list of the tenants in apartment number 1. And as we've talked about, you can actually start thinking to yourself, all right, I have all these little pieces together. I know enough about the pet relationship. You can start predicting what they're going to actually attack, and they try to isolate, the relationship between the pet, non-pet kind of thing, as well as H.
Yeah, question 9 is a great example of this. If you have 2 of the apartments without pets, then all the pet owners must be in a single place. That has to be group 2. We know there's 3 people. So it's very easy to attack these questions if you've approached the game with the right kind of hierarchy or priorities. Focus on numbers and then think how that controls everything beneath it. And then the questions really weren't too bad. My favorite question here was question 12. I just thought this was a great question because it shows you who the pet owners would be as a collective group. And among those 3 people, 2 of them can't go together. So it splits the pet owners into apartments 1 and 2 straight away, and there's your inference. I loved that question. The hardest question, I believe, statistically, is probably question 11. Is that right?
I think it is. It's like 60%, 62%, somewhere right in that general vicinity, which tells you that if the hardest question in a game section is in the low 60s, the section as a whole not considered extremely difficult. Usually we'll see really hard sections drop well below that at times. You, of course, no way to know that at the time when you're only halfway through it. My suspicion here in doing this, I remember even when the test got released and I was first going through it, I was like, guys, there's got to be some danger ahead. Where's the a natural fear?
Yeah.
That would definitely be my type of fear here. And again, as you know some of the pieces, even when you look at the 3 pet owners and the 2 non-pet owners, remember you already have been given one of the non-pet owners. So when you referenced like question number 12, we already knew that J was not a pet owner. So when they say that K is not a pet owner, well, all right, now you have your 2 non-pet owners. That tells you that the other 3 have to be pet owners. Then I can start working through the rules, the groups, seeing exactly what's going on from there. And I think that's what makes this game actually work pretty well is like you're working on 2 different things, the distribution and the pet, non-pet status. And as long as you're tracking that and seeing which connects to which, they both eventually end up converging and working well together.
Yeah, so 12 felt like the most universal test of all the principles in this game. You had to count the pet owners versus non. You had to figure out where they go. You had to remember split blocks, and H has at least one person with it. So there was a lot going on that kind of accumulated in 12 or culminated in 12.
I'd say 13 has some of those elements as well because you have to understand the different interrelationships.
13 puts you in positions where you'd either have 2 pet owners or 4 and a lot of the wrong answers.
Yeah, and I love that 13 as well.
In the right answer, that's what happened. The wrong answer.
Yeah, in the right answer. And I love that too because once again, you've got a question at the end that is allowing you to go back and look at prior work. And some of the work that I did in questions 9 and 12 helped in knocking out some of the early answers in question 13, showing that they could actually be the case.
Yeah.
So This is the piece of advice I give to anybody who's done this test and is listening to this. If you had trouble with the second game, don't just move on. Don't say, okay, I had some trouble. Go back and actually study what was happening. This is a completely typical, prototypical game of what we see on the LSAT today. You should be able to do well on this. And I think everybody who's listening can, and that's equally important. Because I can say, well, you guys could do it, but whether or not you're actually going to go out and be able to do it is really up to the test day and how you feel. I don't think, other than like the test failing, this is the type of game that people should have too much struggle with. They can learn to be good at this type of game.
Yeah. Well, let's go to game 3.
I'm going to let you continue with this one, John, and I'll tell you why. Because it's built upon a very similar skeleton as the second game. In fact, I was surprised when I got to this game and started reading the scenario on it, because I was like, all right, we're just living in the same world almost, just with some changes.
Yeah, I'll elaborate a bit. So the third game here is more grouping. In this case, it's about employee orientation sessions being scheduled out. So there's 5 people going to 3 sessions. It's a little weird how they stagger the timing of these sessions. One's a Wednesday afternoon. The other 2 are on a Friday morning and a Friday afternoon. But notice what we have, 5 people into 3 positions. It's just like the last game, at least roughly, with this 5 to 3 type of distribution. And to remind you of what Dave said, 5 into 3, where all 3 positions have to have something, gives you only 2 distribution possibilities. It's either a 2-2-1 or more extremely a 3-1-1. But we get the same little wrinkle that we had in game 2, which is they introduce the possibility that one of those 3 session spots, Wednesday, Friday, could be empty. So it introduces a 0 into the distribution as well. And then we get exactly what we had in the last game. I mean, it's a perfect duplicate, where now we also have a 3-2-0 distribution allowed here.
Yeah.
So I'm with you. When I saw this, I was like,
it's the same deal.
Yeah, that's kind of them to do this twice in a row.
Even down to the fact that a 4-1-0, which was impossible due to having a maximum of 3 people with pets in the prior game, it's impossible in this game due to variable placement limitations as well as the final rule in the game.
Yeah.
So we end up with the exact same 3 distribution options as we saw in the second game. And you can't ask for it any better than that. It's like being at a baseball game and the pitcher just keeps throwing fastballs at you. After a while, you're like, all right, I know what's coming. I know how to hit this one. So really a very nice setup. The weird thing is what you pointed out. You got a Wednesday afternoon and then Friday morning and afternoon as your options. And so I kind of made out, it looks like a weird kind of like triangle a little bit on its side, where I've got a Wednesday afternoon and then a couple spaces over, I have Friday morning, and then sitting on top of it, Friday afternoon, which allows me to see both the afternoon line, the morning line, and then the day lines, kind of like looking vertically on
so
Wednesday.
You stacked your Friday sessions.
Yeah, I stacked my Friday sessions. I did not do 3 in a row.
I did. I just did 1, 2, 3 left to right.
I don't like that.
Well, clearly, you did it different. But again, we find that I think these are the kinds of like liberties you can take when you're comfortable with what you're doing.
Let's put it this way. It allows me to look at a rule like the first one where it says Q must be scheduled for a Friday session and know, like on a vertical side, that on my diagram, it can go on the right-hand side, which is Friday morning and Friday afternoon. It can't go on the left-hand side, which is Wednesday. You probably threw not laws in there. I did as well.
I just put a not law under Wednesday for Q, and that was it. So
I usually try to arrange things in what I consider to be a visually appealing way for me and how I would interpret, the morning and afternoon. And I see that as being stacked on top of each other. You didn't care. You're just like, it's a line. And it is, because there is actually a time component to this. So that
I just knew that they were chronological. So as long as Friday afternoon's the furthest spot over, I do kind of feel like you just called my diagram ugly. What's visually appealing to you?
No, it's just less elegant. That's all.
You diagram snob.
Less elegant doesn't have to be ugly. It's just not quite as beautiful.
Ouch. All right. Well, while you're having your Met Gala moment, I feel great about this. But to me, again, we're back into that situation where there is a disparity of numbers. There's not going to be this even matching. And that's the first thing, not only to recognize, but to keep in mind. That's going to control the game, very likely above everything else.
Yeah, and there's not many rules in this. There's only 4 rules. And there's like who must be scheduled where. And then there's a little sequence in here. So there's some not laws floating around. You got a couple variables that can't go on Wednesday afternoon. You got a variable that can't go on Friday morning, and then another that can't go on Friday afternoon. Feels like there's some movement. And then you kind of get a numbers rule at the very end about if there is a Friday afternoon session. And again, making sure that you're reminded that there could be up to 3 sessions, but there does not have to be all 3 sessions. Here they say if there is a Friday afternoon, meaning maybe in some cases there are not, you need to have more employees scheduled for Wednesday afternoon than for Friday afternoon. So again, tracking those numbers, which is obviously going to come into play. This is a rule that is not quite as specific as some of the early conditional rules we saw in game 1. So you expect you might see a little bit more of it in this game.
Well, yeah, consider the impact. The first 2 rules here are about single variables of the 5, typically about like single positions. The last rule controls everything. It controls all the variables equally. It controls an entire position as it relates to somewhere else. So when I look at these rules, I'm not just thinking about how each one applies. I'm also thinking about like the impact that they can exert. This last rule is going to be more powerful than the rest.
Yeah, and notice that one of the things that you and I tend to do quite naturally is we're always assessing the power of the rule and how much, like if it's gone too powerful, how that actually limits its usage. And how really broad open rules like a sequence are constantly in play and you're constantly coming back to them. Whereas if you place a variable, that's super helpful, but not so much for that rule, but for how it affects other variables. This assessment and hierarchy, almost like a triage assessment of rules on the LSAT logic games battlefield, is critically important because what it does is it focuses our attention in certain areas and focuses it away from other areas.
Yeah, it gives you an ordered, almost a ranking list of what to consider first, second, third, in terms of how it's likely to apply. It also, and this is a question I know that you get asked a lot as well, people talk to me all the time or ask me all the time, like, when I review games, what should I really be thinking about? What should I be looking for? This is a classic example of something to consider if you didn't at first, or if you were wrong at first. Go back and see how the rules actually played out as the game progressed and the questions were given to you. See what rule actually controlled things the most, and then ask yourself a question of, well, could I have spotted this up front? Could I have seen this in real time? Because if you can, you give yourself a huge advantage.
Yeah, you get a head start compared to the average person. And especially when you go back and you look at the first couple of rules here, and rules 1 and 2 limit 2 variables to just 2 options. So it's like, that's pretty limiting. That's another pretty limiting rule. Then you have a little sequence, that has really 3 options inside of it. And now you've got that starting off what's occurring with some nice limiters, and then you get a big number rule. And we already know we have a numerical distribution. So you want to stop and think about what are the effects there.
Yeah.
And notice that we haven't placed any variables on the diagram at this point. Typical modern day LSAT where it's like, I would love to put a variable in a spot like I did in the pet owners game, but we don't get that here. So it's going to be more open-ended.
Yeah, it's skeletal, which they tend to follow as they did in the last game with a lot of local questions. We'll see if that actually plays out here. I did one additional thing, and maybe we're not quite there yet, but I want to talk about partial templates at some point.
Yes. In fact, let me make one comment about randoms, because both the second game and the third game each have a single random. It was K in the last game. We didn't really get to the discussion there. Here, it's M. And when I think about the variables and I look at everybody like Q and S being limited to 2 spots each, and then T and P being in a sequence, that means those variables, because they have fewer options, I have to kind of keep my eye on them. Whereas M is like, I don't care. M's going anywhere M wants to go as long as M adheres to the numerical rules. And so let's talk about those partial templates that you're about to mention, because I think that's an interesting way of thinking about some of the positioning on this game.
Sure. The genesis for me, at least, was when that last rule came about, which, paraphrased, says if you do anything Friday afternoon, if anybody goes in that Friday afternoon session, more people have to go in the first spot on Wednesday. So it's conditional, clearly, but it's triggered by the idea of something happening Friday, and then you get this numerical relationship, really a greater than type of relationship. And so I started to think about, well, what's allowed then on Friday? What happens if nobody goes Friday afternoon? Let's look then at Wednesday and the other Friday session in the morning, because you would get a 3-2 split there, or in some way 2 and 2, and then M, the floater you just mentioned, moves around. And I was like, that's pretty powerful. That's 4 out of 5 filled in definitively. So I sketched it. And I was like, what happens if as many people go Friday afternoon, which would be 2, and then you'd have 3 to have more on Wednesday. I was like, well, who are the 3 and the 2? And you can actually determine that precisely. You know exactly who the 2 groups were. The only thing left then was, what happens if only one person goes in that Friday afternoon position, which would trigger the rule. We'd need 2 or more on Wednesday, again, to satisfy the rule. And that's the one that's a little less certain. You can't really begin to fill in the variables quite as well there. But 2 of the 3 templates that I could draw, the 0 on Friday and the 2 on Friday afternoon, those really fill in nicely. So I sketched those out, which is a rarity for me.
Yeah, and I didn't.
Yeah, and you didn't, which is even stranger. Usually if I've written something down, you've written it down even better.
Well, and if you're listening to this and you're like, well, wait, if nobody goes on Friday afternoon, that rule isn't triggered. You're right. That rule is not triggered because if there is a Friday afternoon session. However, if you eliminate Friday afternoon, that means the 5 variables have to go on Wednesday afternoon and Friday morning. And there are limitations on what can happen there. And that's why you can fill in so much.
Yeah, and that's where the other 3 rules begin to actually place things with M not mentioned floating around. But yeah, 4 of your 5 get split 2 and 2, Wednesday and Friday morning in that scenario. So to me, I found those really useful and was gratified to see that they actually paid me back in the very second question, I suppose, question number 15. I found them really useful.
Yeah, I would imagine so, because then, I was kind of forced to, look at what I had. But again, it's a global question. It's an absolute idea. You can fight your way through it. I think this was a question, if I recall, I came back to. This is where I skipped 15, and I knew that I'd already done 14, and 14, I think, helps eliminate one of the answers, if I recall correctly. And 14, which is another beautiful list question, our best friend right out of the gate, I really like 14 because it shows you the 3-2-0 is, physically possible. It's right there. You can actually see it and be like, oh, okay, perfect. And then it helps answer 15 as well. But the last question, which is 18, I think also helped answer 15. And so for me, I did that classic thing where in this case, you went and did that because you felt like you had enough knowledge about what was going on there. And I was like, I'm going to come back to it, and just after I've learned more about the game itself.
Yeah, it's funny, and I'm not sure that I'm a role model in this, but I will often sketch out templates if I'm not sure what they're going to look like. Whereas I think most people only commit to templates when they're confident that they're going to be useful. I'm far more likely to investigate it if I'm on the fence. That is, again, that's a sort of do what else I say, and not in this instance what I do.
No, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I usually will explore them when I feel like the likelihood is good, and that usually is driven by a limitation assessment. Either I see some type of limitation that I think is going to be tough to get around, or I can see enough rules that are forcing things left and right that I'm like, I can do this.
Yeah, that makes sense. Here, I was just curious, like, what do the numbers actually look like as they play out? I'm, as always, a victim of curiosity as opposed to confidence.
Yeah, well, the first 2 questions are global. They don't add anything else to the game, and they just kind of test your understanding of it. And then 16, 17, and 18 are all local. And that's part of the reason that I moved on. I was like, I don't have the answer to 15 off the top of my head, but I can see a bunch of local questions when I tab through the screens. And so then I was able to do the work and then come on back, and we're in good shape.
Yeah, question 18 is probably my favorite of the bunch there. I really liked the way that question just played itself out. It's a very good test of things.
Yeah, they talked about pairs of employees a lot in this game. Clearly they wanted you to look at not just the granular individual variable level, but how pairs of variables had to work together, which, given all the 2 position restrictions in the first couple of rules, makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. But again, I don't know if this is harder than the second game. I guess for most people it may have been. But I still haven't seen anything in this section, and we're 3 games deep, that I felt like, buckle up.
My take was that this was harder. I feel like it's incrementally harder. The pets, non-pets thing was so powerful, and it was this second level of information that I feel like people were able to grab onto. They didn't get that in this game, and then they get this kind of wacky morning, afternoon thing. I feel like this ticks a little bit higher on the difficulty level.
Yeah, I imagine the second game is probably very polarizing. If you caught the power of the 3 pets, 2 no pets, you're in great shape. If you didn't, that game probably felt extremely tough.
It probably felt harder than this third game, which would have been a little bit more simplified. Sometimes people think that additional information makes a game harder because it's more to juggle and so forth. A lot of times I think it makes it easier because I have more points that I can latch onto. It's like climbing a mountain. I want more handholds.
Right.
The more information that I have floating around out there, the more options I have to create my own route up the face of the mountain.
Yeah, nothing's harder to climb than a smooth rock, right?
I wouldn't know since I don't
Yeah, I don't
climb rocks. I just admire Alex Honnold.
Yeah, I just watched that documentary. That's all I got.
God, that dude. What was it? I just saw an interview with him, a different one. And some kid who's like 18 had climbed and broken his speed wall record.
I saw this too.
He'd done it in like 58 minutes, and the kid went up and did it in like 55. And Honnold heard about it and was like, what? So he drives up to wherever this mountain is and does it in 34 minutes.
Something like that. Just obliterates it to the point where everybody's like, let's just let him have it.
He's the greatest.
That's his forever now.
If you don't know who we're talking about, it's Alex Honnold. He's the subject of the documentary that I think won an Oscar called Free Solo. He's the guy that climbs all sorts of crazy mountains like El Cap with no ropes, no safety harness, nothing, just free with his hands. It's insane.
Yeah, that particular one was El Capitan, but he'll climb anything.
Yeah. Let's move on to the fourth game.
All right.
I love this game. I don't know how you felt about it, but I was like, this is a fantastic end to a great section.
I liked it because it was the end of the section.
This, again, the third game had some difficulty to it, but I didn't feel like we'd ratchet it into like stained glass windows territory or computer virus. So my big fear was what's lurking at the end. The only thing I knew was that when you open it up, that there's only going to be 5 questions. So even if it's devastating, it's not going to obliterate your section. It's not 6, 7, or even, 8 questions as we've seen occasionally in the past. So I knew that, all right, this is probably going to be something that I feel is of a higher level difficulty or should be.
Mm-hmm.
And even if it is, it's not going to be the worst situation because I only have 5 questions. I can power my way through it. Happily, though, for people who took this test at any point in time and had it as a scored section, that's not what happens. This last game, I think, is actually very easy and easy to attack. And so let's break it down a little bit. So a lot of times in a game like this, there's little elements that throw people off. And this is a game about a television special and commercials being shown. And there are 5 advertisers that they list out, F through K. And the first thing that threw people off was that they said each kind of advertiser has a commercial in a short version and a long version. And after the test had come out, and in prior tests, people were like, this was confusing to me. There's 2 versions of the same variable. Is it though? It's just kind of like F is long and F is short. Well, I'll come back to what happens with that, because what they say is that only one version is going to be shown. So there may be 10 options initially, short and long, of 5 commercials, but only 5 of those 10 is going to be used. And the fact that it's just short and long of each one, I think makes it really easy. And then they talk about the order the commercials are shown and whether or not the short or long version is shown is subject to a bunch of rules. Mm-hmm. So the question you have to ask yourself is, how are you going to show that? Well, it's order. So to me, there's going to be 5 spaces. We are ordering commercials. Here's where you have to make the distinction that I think makes the game easy. We know that each one of the advertisers, F through K, is going to appear. So I just created a row for that. Mm-hmm. I'm like, here's one row, and it's going to be filled in with F, G, H, I, and K.
Yeah, advertiser names.
Yeah, what's the big question in each spot? Well, it's which version is being shown, short or long. So then I created another row right on top of that. I stacked these up, and that was the long or short row. And so there are 10 open spaces here. The bottom row is numbered 1 through 5, and that is our, basically our advertisers. And then the top row is just whether or not the commercial for each advertiser is long or short, and it can only be one of the 2. I don't know how many longs there are. I don't know how many shorts there are yet, but that is how I set this up. And so this is an advanced linear game that we're looking at, but it is balanced because you know you've got 5 advertisers and you know that you have the long or short choice for each one. So I felt pretty good at this point. The long and short thing didn't throw me off, and you don't have to worry about the fact that there are actually 10 options because you're always only using 5 and exactly 5. And every time you use F, whether it's short or long, that's it for F. F doesn't get used again. It only gets used once. There is not a replacement kind of approach to this where using it once doesn't, take it out. It does take it out.
Yeah, you and I saw this the exact same way, set it up the exact same way. I saw order and knew we had done 2 games of grouping, and now we're back to linear. I saw this additional criterion of short or long. That just meant another row to me. And I saw the 5 into 5, so the numbers matched, unlike 5 into 3 for the last 2 games. And so it was like one and done. When something's placed, it's finished, and everything gets placed, and every spot gets filled. The only real uncertainty here is the length, short or long for each position.
Yeah, because you know the 5 advertisers. Now it's a matter of dealing with that. I will point out about this section that in the crystal ball, we've been talking a lot about how the typical LSAT logic game section has 2 grouping games, 1 advanced linear and 1 basic linear. What do you think this test is? It's that. So you started off with basic linear. You had 2 grouping games. So to close on an advanced linear game is kind of like just bring it on home. I mean, you can see that that is matching the predictions that we've been making, which is really awesome. So let's look at the rules here because the rules are friendly. I'm all for them. They're all really standard linear rules. I think they're super helpful. So the first rule is like, hey, 2 of the commercials are going to be the long version. Well, thank you, because that means that there's even fewer options that I'm worried about now, and I can just establish that in this case, G and K are both long.
Yeah, it assigns length of commercial to 2 of your 5 variables straight away. It's great.
Yeah. And by the way, in diagramming that rule, I showed as vertical, where L is on top and G is below it in a block. So it's like it'll fit anywhere onto the diagram that I make. And the same thing with K, where L is on top and K is below it, and it is, again, a block around it.
Yeah, but without getting my hopes too far up, I showed that the same way too.
Dang.
Look at us coming together in the end. There's got to be a better way to say that.
Second rule.
Yeah.
Don't say that again.
I won't.
Second rule is establishing that the third commercial has to be long. Well, I like that. So now I could fill in that third space on that upper row with an L. I don't know which of the advertisers is going in there. I don't really care. I just know that one's long. And then we get a beautiful rule that made my life a lot easier. And that is that no 2 consecutive commercials can be long. Okay, well, if I just made the third kind of advertisement commercial a long one, and I cannot have 2 consecutive commercials be long, what does that tell you about the second and fourth commercials? Can they be long? No, they have to be short. And now our big uncertainty, what's short and what's long, is now set up through the middle of this diagram with short as second, long as third, and short as third. And that is all triggered by the third being long and not being able to have 2 consecutive long advertisements going there.
I'm going to interject a quick point because I know you and I are both hypersensitive to potential errors that people could make. And when I saw the first rule, where G and K were both long, and I saw the second rule, where the long commercial was in number 3, or a long commercial was number 3, immediately I thought to myself, I wonder how many people put G or K as the third commercial, thinking one of the other had to be there. That would be a mistake.
That would be one mistake to avoid. Here's another to avoid. Now, you know that the second and fourth commercials are short. Some people assumed that that meant that the first and the fifth were long.
Alternate, yeah.
Yeah, you don't know that. You can have 2 short commercials in a row. There's no prohibition on that. You simply cannot have 2 long commercials. So when the third one is long, that means 2 and 4 cannot be long. They have to be short. But when 2 is short, that does not mean that 1 is short or long. It could be either. And the same thing with 4. 4 being short does not mean that 5 is long. It could be short or long. So those are uncertain.
Yeah, good point.
Still, it's not that much of an uncertainty. It's just one or the other.
It's not too bad. Yeah, the binary nature of short and long is great. I will draw any listeners who are course students of ours, I'll draw your attention to the first game in lesson 4, where trucks arrive at a warehouse 1 through 7, and the trucks are either red or green. If you've done that game and then you see this, or vice versa, I suppose, you are well positioned to not make the kinds of mistakes that Dave and I fear for you.
Yeah, don't make an assumption based upon like it feels like that's the way that it'd be. Because it kind of looks nice if it was long, short, long, short, long.
Mhm.
Just doesn't have to be that way. So be careful there. You know that there's at least 2 long commercials here. So one of them has to be long. You just don't know that both of them are.
Exactly.
And the reason I know there has to be at least 2 is from the first rule.
First rule.
Now, finishing off the rule set here, you can see the first 3 are great. They're all powerful, linear. The last rule might be the best of them all because to me, it triggered a chain reaction that I thought made this game really quite easy. And this rule says it involves 3 variables. And it says that H's commercial must be shown later than I's. Okay, so a sequence. I is before H. And that H's commercial is immediately before K. So now we've got a block, an HK block. And that's interesting because I'm like, wait, didn't I see something about K before? Because I've got I ahead of an HK block. Yeah, K is a long variable or a long commercial, which means automatically that you know that H cannot be another long commercial, would have to be short as well. But that kind of like I is ahead of HK is really powerful when you know that K is a long commercial. And to me, it triggered a templating approach because I said, you know that HK block, irrespective of everything else, it can't be in 1 and 2 because I has to be before it. So what are the options for that HK block? It's either 2, 3, 3, 4, or 4, 5 in the positioning. So that, irrespective of everything, is what HK could do, except for the fact that H and K are set up where K is long. So I could put it in 2 and 3. That would work. Could I put it in 3 and 4? Nope, because we know 4 is short. We know K is long, so 3, 4 is out, and then I could put it in 4, 5. So I knew that this block placement, HK, was either placed in 2 and 3 positions or 4 and 5 positions, and so I made templates.
I didn't.
And
I saw them. I said, oh, there's only 2 places to put that block. 2, 3 with HK or 4, 5 with HK. And 4, 5 is even more interesting in my opinion because it would tell you that the 5th commercial, K in that case, would be long. So it actually fills in an extra piece if that's the one that happens. I saw it.
Yeah.
I just didn't feel like writing anymore.
I just, that's too lazy for me at that point because I was like, look, there's 2 big directions. And the beautiful thing is when H and K is in 2 and 3, that means I has to be first. And then you've got F and G still left over. Well, we know G is long, so it can't be 4th. So G has to be 5th. We know that's long. That means that F is 4th. It fills in everything except whether I is short or long.
In the first spot, yeah.
Yeah. And then when you have H and K in the 4th and 5th spot, it's more open. There's more options underneath that template. But that felt great to me, and I felt very confident going in. I was already pretty well ahead on time, and so it was just a matter of like, let me just pound through the last couple of questions. But with that information, no fear whatsoever.
Yeah, I breathed a real sigh of relief when I saw this game because I think, like you and most people, were anticipating something far more grisly to close the section out. And sometimes when you only see 5 questions at the end, you know they've got a real trick up their sleeve too. They like to do that. I think the virus game was that way.
Yeah.
But in this case, yeah, it was mild as can be.
Yeah, I didn't think it was too much at all. And, you know, the questions didn't tremendously rely on you having to like go do additional work. There was a lot more of like, okay, count this out. If there's more short commercials than long, well, both the templates allow for that. So then I just had to look inside the templates and see what was happening with each. There's another list question floating around in there. But a lot of this was really easy to do. I didn't do a whole lot more drawing after I'd made that setup. I just was in there answering questions and largely eliminating answers. I did a lot of that on like question 20, for example.
Yeah, I was going to say, question 20, I could see where the templates would really help. I did 20, but I sort of just flagged it in my mind of like, if anything changes as I do more questions, I'll revisit this. But I really liked 21 and 22 to get to as early as possible. Both of those questions to me really made the game more concrete, I suppose, in my estimations of it, because I didn't write hardly anything for this game.
See, I already had that concrete aspect because I'd made the templates. Like in 22, it says F's commercial shown earlier than I's. Well, I'm like, that's not my first template, so that's got to be my second template where H and K are 4th and 5th. And then it was just a matter of understanding that there were really 2 configurations for F, I, and G, and then that gives you your answer really quickly.
And then we get to the final question, which I think, again, we have to touch on, at least briefly, because it is the one and only rule substitution question on this
Truly.
test, which for a lot of people is, terrifying.
Well, this is the question that they fear at the end because they know it's typically more time consuming. And maybe the game doesn't seem that hard. Maybe that there's only 5 questions, but if the last one is a rule sub and they only have 2 minutes left, they're thinking, I might not finish this. I don't think this is going to rank as one of the harder rule substitution questions, though, of all time. And, let's take a look at what they say. So they want you to take out one of the rules and kind of replace it with an idea that has the same effect. So I'm not going to go much further than that. In this case, the constraint that they want substituted out is you can't have 2 long commercials in a row. And so when they say, what would have the same effect on the selection and ordering? The first thing to think about it was, what was the effect of that rule?
Yeah, what did it do?
Yeah, what did it do in this game, John? I'll let you handle the play out on this.
Oh, well, most immediately, it affected the things on either side of it. So the 2 consecutive long commercial prohibition that's now been removed but meant to be replaced really came into being in the 3rd position, which we were told was a long commercial. So right away from the original, we knew if long commercials can't touch or be adjacent, then the things around that 3rd long commercial have to be short. So 2 was a short commercial, 4 was a short commercial, but that was the effect of the rule originally. To replace it, if you could simply engineer the exact same effect, that is very often a good way to recreate the rule itself.
Yeah, and in fact, that's the answer.
And spoiler.
You've previewed it perfectly. Yeah, there it is. That is actually the correct answer. It's the last one on the list of 5, and it's like, wait, when I saw that, I was like, yes, that is exactly what I was looking for. I thought a little bit about the HK block, and I was like, no, it won't change anything in terms of that because K is the one that's dictating where that can go. I don't have to worry about H being short automatically. That actually happens from knowing that 2 and 4 are short there in that context. So they actually cover all the basic effects of what's occurring, and E is a perfect substitute. But the first place to check on a rule substitution is what's the immediate effect? And then to look at the answers and say, does this make this happen? And if it does, it's a contender, and make sure that it doesn't add anything additional that shouldn't be there.
Yeah.
It doesn't happen here. And
I always think of wrong answers in rule substitutions either being too strict, in other words, they prohibit things that could have originally occurred, or being too loose. Yeah. Wait, now I can do something I used to not be able to. Every wrong answer, as far as I'm concerned, is going to fail for one or the other. And sure enough, the 4, A through D in this case, do.
Yeah, either they don't reach the threshold of doing enough or they
exceed it.
Do too much. They go over. They're either under or over. Those are what wrong answers are. And, there's a skill to writing these types of questions. I have a lot of respect for the people who do it, but E matches perfectly in this case. And it's the direct, immediate effect that you can see in the diagram. And there you have it. And that's the section.
There was one final surprise that awaited me, at least, on this test, which is what happened when I actually looked at the curve. This was a -9 scale, or a 170. And oftentimes a scale, and that's on the loose side for anyone who's wondering what I mean, oftentimes a scale that's looser like that, what would be like a -12 or -13 in the good old days, it's born out of a section of games that is of particular difficulty. You can feel the punishment of games as the scale reflects it. This scale clearly reflected a greater degree of difficulty than average, and yet the games is not where it was.
No, which means that they were pointing towards other sections, but I think also there's another level to this. This was one of the bubble tests.
I knew you were going to say that, and you're right.
And we go back in time and we figure, what happened? We know that period of time in the mid-2020 LSAT era produced incredibly inflated LSAT scores. More than double the number of scores in the 175 to 180 range. Huge increases in scores at all the lower levels from basically 150 on up.
Yeah.
So we refer to that as the bubble. We've talked about on the podcast many times. When you go back and you look at this and you realize these games aren't that tough, but it's married to a -9 scale. That's a huge error. I think this test was misscaled.
I do too.
And, I think that's part of the reason we got this. I think it's also one of the reasons they released this test. because they would have to, if they reused it, they'd have to change the scaling. They don't want to do that. And so ultimately, when I look at it historically, I'm like, well, I can understand why a bubble would be produced by a test like this, because anybody who was like halfway decent at games eviscerated this section. They either got them all right or they missed one or two at most. And that means that even if the reading comp is super hard, even if LR is abnormally difficult, they've built themselves a cushion right off their LG performance. That's the problem. That's how bubbles
I would
go.
say the same thing for test 90 plus, which was a May 2020 exam that's also been released, also -9. We haven't done the games officially yet on this, but we will.
Podcast.
Yeah, we'll get to those in a podcast episode down the road. And I imagine we're probably going to echo this same sentiment. This was misscaled as well.
Yeah, we'll probably float around in the 80s, 90s for a couple tests here. Maybe we'll go back. I don't know. We'll figure out what we want to do next.
Let's find a song we like and then match the year.
Find the year
That's
of
the way to
song.
approach this. Yeah.
How many LSATs occurred in 1977? Some Zeppelin or Pink Floyd or something like that. All right, John, any final comments on this section that we haven't made yet?
No. One final comment on the nature of this project, if you could call it that, is I really am glad we're able to do this. Getting into the games, it feels a lot less like the typical kind of, LSAT capriciousness reporting that we tend to do. Like, what's the latest update or the latest policy? Oh, now you can't use scratch paper for the writing sample.
Oh,
Fabulous.
Yeah. Forgot to mention that ridiculous new rule.
It'll come up again and again. So it's not the last you'll hear of it.
Profound stupidity? Yeah, it's not the last I'm going to hear about it from LSAC.
Dropping bombs right at the end.
And they're not listening at this point.
Yeah.
They thought they were free and clear, but no.
But I love actually getting my hands dirty with test content. I know you're excited to do this too. So if there are particular requests that people have, we'll do our best to at least acknowledge them, maybe honor them as we go forward. We're open to suggestions as we do this, because this, for me, is one of the most fun things we're able to do.
Yeah, and I think our format's going to be very similar going forward. Focus on the setup, focus on discussions about choices made, why rules are more important or less important. Less of a focus on questions until we think the question is worthy of having that discussion. And sometimes, there are, in this test, I didn't think there were a lot of questions that needed a lot of discussion. There are other tests where there's a bunch of questions that need discussion, or the question is really helpful to understand the game. So it'll change a little bit as we do it each time, but that'll just be in reference to the nature of the games and what we know about what's going on inside them. All right, John, on that note, if you get a chance, please subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else that you may find it. And if you've enjoyed it, please leave us a 5-star rating. We don't accept anything less than that. If you have any questions, you can send those to lsatpodcast@powerscore.com. We're always happy to help. And certainly, we're always compiling questions for the mailbag episodes that we do every couple of months. On that note, stay safe out there, and we will talk to you soon.